are near the end of Acts. Paul had survived the shipwreck, which was because of a great and mighty storm. They had been stuck in that storm for 14 days. And in a time when they navigated by the position of the sun and the stars, they couldn't see either one. They were totally lost. When they came to this island that Paul was shipwrecked on, the sailors didn't know which one it was. And the ship, it really shipwrecked. The front of it ran aground on a reef, and the back of it, well, Scripture tells us that the people who couldn't swim grabbed hold of boards and parts of the ship. In other words, that thing was falling apart so fast. And so that brings up the question of the day. If you're shipwrecked and the ship is sinking, do you take your wallet with you? Mine's not very thick, not much weight to it. I probably wouldn't even remember it's in my pocket. Okay, ladies, would you take your purse? One of you saying, no, not really. Well, back then, the wallet was, paper money hadn't been invented yet. So a wallet with some money was a hefty thing. So do you swim with 5 pounds around your waist? No, maybe you have a little more money. 10. No. When Paul landed, logic tells us there was no money. So how does he survive for 3 months? Because that's when he gets on board to go to the next place. Well, God has arranged for this. First, Paul is bitten by a snake. I know you're thinking, how is God arranging for him to be taken care of by having Paul bitten by a snake? Well, think of it. The people see that Paul has been bitten by a snake, and they immediately, in their teaching of the day, said, he must be a murderer. But when Paul does not, because in their understanding, anyone who survived the shipwreck only to be bitten by a snake, the gods must be trying to punish them. And therefore, they must be somebody horrible. Well, when Paul didn't drop dead suddenly, and didn't swell up from the reaction to the snake bite, the people began to think, he must be a god. And so right after they tell us that people are saying he must be a god, we have Paul and Luke being entertained by the chief man of the island. And yes, technically that is his official title, chief man. He's being entertained for 3 days. Now, we're not told whether all 270-some passengers and sailors of that ship were being entertained by this man. But we know Paul and Luke were, because it says we were entertained. And so after the 3rd day, Paul goes and prays for this man's father. And then comes the next part of God's provision. Paul prays for him, lays hands on him, and chief man's father is healed. Word gets out that everyone with diseases on the island is healed. Now that may not be too amazing when we think about how many people that Paul has healed, or what the effects of Paul laying hands on people. In fact, we know from earlier on, there were times where handkerchiefs and aprons taken for Paul were allowed to go to the sick, and they would be healed just in contact with clothing. So it's not too much strange. But when you look at where we have been, the last person to be healed in the book of Acts that is recorded was way back in chapter 20. Now, timeline, we know that Paul was in jail for 2 years while he was waiting to be tried, and being tried over And then after that time, he was on this long extended version. So we can be pretty sure. And then before that, there was a trip from Ephesus to Jerusalem. We can pretty much guess that it was 2.5 to 3 years since the last time according to Scripture, it was that length of time since anyone had been healed by Paul through the power of God. And then suddenly, everybody on the island is being healed. This is quite a change from the activity for the last 2 to 3 years of just being in prison. Paul had no other resources, and all of a sudden, Paul is healing people, and then we're told that when they went to sail 3 months later, everything they needed was provided for Paul's trip. It says the people there had honored us with many honors. Other translations said they had given us many gifts. When you think about it, Paul, who had been in prison, had no ability to earn an income. When he was a missionary, he was a tent maker. He made actual tents. But as a prisoner, he can't do that. And he sure didn't have any tent-making equipment to survive the shipwreck. So his income comes from the gifts that he receives from the people. He is totally dependent on the gifts, these honors that he receives, more than most times. And this really shows us one of the basic truths that we sometimes forget. This illustrates it much more clearly. You see, Scripture tells us that God created everything. And it has long been the understanding of Christians that everything in the world belongs to God. And that we, as His people, are merely stewards or caretakers of these possessions that are in our midst. But a lot of times we begin to think, I'm not just a caretaker. I own it all. When somebody is the guardian of property or the trustees of property for somebody else, and then they proceed to take it as their own, there are certain laws that prohibit that. We can't do that. But oftentimes we say, all this I have accomplished is mine. But the reality is, for those who farm, God made the soil. God provides the rain and the sun. And I know, lately you'd like a lot more sun and a lot less rain. But we can't do any of that. Now, people have studied and improved on seed. But nobody can just take raw ingredients and make a seed that grows a real live plant. They can genetically modify it, but they can't create it out of nothing. That's God's work. God gives us the ability to think, to learn, to earn. All of these things are gifts that God has given us. And sometimes we forget that we are dependent on God. Here on the island of Malta, Paul has no choice but to realize he is totally dependent on God. Not only for his time, 3 months, but in the future. And it's very important for Paul that he have some financial resources. Back in Roman times, prisoners were kept in very bad places. And it is not, and dangerous prisoners would sometimes be lowered into cisterns through holes about the size of a manhole. Person hole. And they would be lowered down And then that would also be the air intake for the area. There were no rules about how many square feet a prisoner needed to have. And so when Paul gets to Rome, he's able to stay at a house by himself. But the Roman government doesn't pay for that house. It has to be provided by him or other people acting on his behalf. And so he is dependent in his life. In many ways, it's dependent on him having a source of income to pay for this house that he and the soldier lived in. And all of this comes because God suddenly allows Paul the opportunity to heal the chief man's father. And then to heal all the other sick. But God also provides for us. Now, one of the neat things is that we as Christians get to be on both sides of that equation. There are times when God provides for us, either in our ability to earn and ability, and sometimes through the generosity of other people. But he also allows us to be the one who give, to help other people in their times. You go to funerals and you often will give a memorial. And sometimes those go to the memorial and sometimes they just pay for the funeral. Because that needs to be done too. God allows us both opportunities to provide for and to be provided for. Let me try that again. To be the recipients of the gifts. And he also allows us to be the one for whom the gift is passed through from him to other people. It is sometimes incredibly incredible when we can get to be both the giver. There are times that it is just a shock when God arranges things to provide. My sister-in-law, my sister and her husband own a body shop, and she told me a few years ago about how sometimes when the bills wouldn't match and there was no way they were going to meet the payroll on Friday, suddenly one or two of the customers said, "Well, I know my car's not done, but the insurance company just sent me the check and I want to get rid of it before I lose it. So let me just sign it over and give you the check." He said, "I can't tell you how many times money has walked in the door that was not due yet. And we're still in business because of it." On the other times, there are times where we get to be the ones who give. When Amanda and I lived in Kasota, before we came here, we had just adopted Katie, and the red Escort we had would not fit 3 car seats side by side by side. We tried. It would not do it. So we needed a different vehicle, and that's how we ended up buying our green van. Yes, it was when Katie was born, so you know how long ago this story was. And then the question, what do we do with the old Escort? The dealer didn't want it. So what do we do with this old car? That had been a good car for us. Well, we sat down one day and talked. And we said, you know, rather than give it to this organization or this organization, I'd rather give it to our old next door neighbor's daughter. And we both agreed, yes, that's what we'd rather do. So I called our old next door neighbor and said, we have this car and we were wondering about giving it to your daughter for her graduation birthday. You know, it wasn't much value to us materially. And I got this. Yeah. The answer on the other line, there was no excitement, no joy, just a sort of a disbelief. Later on, we found out why the disbelief. At the end of her junior year, her father told her, "You know the family situation, you know our finances, you know I have no money to give you a car. And if you're going to go to college next year, you're going to need the car. The old one we have is going to be needed by your sister, and then a year later by your brother. So if you're going to have a car, you're going to need to pray for it." And so this girl had been praying very regularly for a year for a car. And so the disbelief was, it was going to show up on her birthday. I can tell you, that was one of the neatest things we had done. Because God had used us to be the instrument of blessing her. And while we were blessing her, we were really blessing her parents. But we're reminded once again that it is indeed God in charge, God who can fill our needs even when there's no way we can do it. Paul was in that position where there was no way he could provide for himself, and that's when God just opened up the gates. And he was providing for him. The good news is, God still does that. He both uses us to bless other people, and He blesses us when we do not have. We need to count on Him. And both to give and to receive from Him. Let us live as His people, trusting Him always, for He is the source of all.